The Cuban Missile Crisis was a pivotal moment in the Cold War, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. It took place in October 1962, lasting for 13 tense days. The crisis occurred when the United States discovered that the Soviet Union had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. coast. This alarming revelation sent shockwaves through the American government and sparked fears of a nuclear conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Tensions had been rising for years due to the ideological and military rivalry between the two superpowers. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the world has ever come to full-scale nuclear war, and how the leaders of the U.S. and the USSR handled the situation would define the future of global diplomacy and security. To understand the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's essential to look at the broader context of the Cold War. The Cold War was a period of tension between the Soviet Union and the United States, starting after World War II in 1945. The two countries had opposing political ideologies. The U.S. supported capitalism and democracy, while the Soviet Union championed communism. This rivalry resulted in a series of proxy wars, arms races, and political confrontations. In 1959, Fidel Castro led a communist revolution in Cuba, which became a key ally of the Soviet Union. The U.S. had long been worried about Cuba's communist influence so close to its shores. In 1961, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, where the U.S. tried to overthrow Castro, made the Cuban government more hostile to the U.S. and brought Cuba and the Soviet Union even closer together, setting the stage for the Missile Crisis. In the summer of 1962, the Soviet Union secretly began building missile sites in Cuba. These sites were designed to house medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles that could reach much of the eastern United States. The U.S. government, under President John F. Kennedy, was unaware of this development until October 14, 1962, when an American U-2 spy plane took high-altitude photographs of the missile sites in Cuba. The images showed the construction of missile silos and other military installations, confirming that the Soviets were placing nuclear weapons in Cuba. This discovery was a game-changer. The U.S. immediately recognized that the missiles would significantly alter the balance of power and could be used to launch a nuclear attack on America. President Kennedy and his advisors now had to decide how to respond to this threat. The U.S. government faced an urgent and complex decision. The discovery of the missiles was seen as a direct threat to American security, and a military response seemed likely. However, President Kennedy understood the grave consequences of launching an attack on Cuba and potentially starting a nuclear war. After much debate, Kennedy chose to take a more measured approach by imposing a naval blockade around Cuba to prevent the further delivery of Soviet missiles. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy publicly addressed the American people, revealing the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba and announcing the blockade. He demanded that the Soviet Union remove the missiles and warned that any missile launch from Cuba would be considered an attack on the United States, potentially leading to war. The naval blockade, or quarantine, was a way to pressure the Soviets while avoiding immediate military confrontation. For the next few days, the world held its breath. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a tense standoff. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev initially rejected the United States' demands to remove the missiles, and both sides prepared for potential conflict. American military forces were put on alert, and nuclear weapons were readied. In Cuba, Soviet missiles were moved into position, and both sides braced for possible war. Behind the scenes, however, diplomacy was at work. After tense exchanges of letters between Kennedy and Khrushchev, both leaders sought to find a way out of the crisis without resorting to war. The diplomatic channels remained open, with United Nations Ambassador Adlai Stevenson and others working to de-escalate the situation. Finally, on October 28, 1962, after days of intense negotiations, Khrushchev agreed to remove the Soviet missiles from Cuba and secret removal of United States missiles from Turkey. The deal was a major victory for diplomacy, and the crisis was officially over. The Cuban Missile Crisis had a profound impact on international relations. Archival footage of Khrushchev making a statement, images of Soviet missile removal from Cuba, and the easing of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. In the aftermath, both sides realized the dangers of direct confrontation and the need for better communication. One of the key outcomes was the establishment of a direct hotline between the White House and the Kremlin, known as the Hotline, to ensure that leaders could communicate quickly in the event of future crises. The Cuban Missile Crisis also led to arms control agreements, such as the Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which banned nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. The crisis demonstrated the importance of diplomacy in resolving conflicts and showed the world how close humanity had come to nuclear disaster. While it did not end the Cold War, it marked a turning point in how the United States and the Soviet Union interacted during this period of history. The Cuban Missile Crisis was one of the most critical events of the Cold War, and its resolution remains a testament to the power of diplomacy in preventing global conflict. It showed how close the world came to nuclear war and highlighted the importance of communication between superpowers. The crisis also reshaped international relations and led to significant arms control measures in the years that followed. Although the Cold War would continue for several more decades, the Cuban Missile Crisis marked a moment of intense confrontation, but also a moment when leaders made the difficult choices necessary to avoid catastrophic consequences. The lessons learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis still resonate today, reminding us of the importance of diplomacy, dialogue, and the responsible use of military power. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more history lessons.